the Apostle of Mercy, by Abul Hassan Ali Nadwi. Chapter 1, The Age of Ignorance. Religious Conditions in the World. Great religions of the world had spread the light of faith, morals and learnings in the ages past, but every one of these had been rendered a disgrace to its name by the 6th century of the Christian era. Crafty innovators, unscrupulous dissemblers, and impious priests and preachers had, with the passage of time, so completely distorted the scriptures and disfigured the teachings and commandments of their own religions that it was almost impossible to recall the original shape and content of these religions. Could the founders or the prophets of any one of them have returned to earth, he would be unquestionably have refused to own his own religion and denounced his followers as apostates and idolaters. Judaism had by then been reduced to an amalgam of dead rituals, sacrament, without any spark of life left in it. Also, being a religion upholding racial snobbery and supremacy, it was never had any message for other nations or good for the entire humanity at large. It had not even remained firmly welded to its belief in the unicity of God, which had once been its distinguishing feature, and had raised its adherents to a level higher than that of the followers of the ancient polytheist cults, and as commanded by Prophet Abraham to his sons and his grandson Jacob. The Jews had, under the influence of their powerful neighbors and conquerors, adopted numerous beliefs and rituals as acknowledged by modern Jewish authorities. Quote, the thunderings of the prophets against idolatry show, however, had the cults of the deities were deeply rooted in the hearts of the Israeli people, and they did not appear to have been thoroughly suppressed until after the return from their Babylonian exile. Through mysticism and magic, many polytheistic ideas and customs again found their way amongst the people, and the Talmud confirms the fact that idolatrous worship is seductive. Unquote. The Babylonian Gemara, that is popular during the 6th century and often referred to the Torah by Orthodox Jewry, typically illustrates the crudeness of the 6th century Jews' intellectual and religious understanding by its scholars, and remarks about God and many and absurd and outrageous beliefs and ideas which lack not sensibility but also inconsistent with Jewish faith in monotheism. Christianity had fallen prey to in its very infancy to the misguided fervor of the overzealous evangelists, unwarranted interpretation of its tenets by ignorant church fathers, and of the Gentile converts to Christianity. How the doctrine of Trinity came into being for the first claim to the Christian dogma by the close of the 4th century had been described in the New Catholic Encyclopedia. Quote, it is difficult in the second half of the 20th century to offer a clear, objective and straightforward account of the revelations, the doctrinal evolution and the theological elaboration of the mystery of the Trinity. Trinitarian discussions, Roman Catholics as well as others, present a somewhat unsteady silhouette. Two things have happened. There is a recognition of the part of the exegists and the biblical theologians, including a constantly growing number of Roman Catholics, that one should not speak of Trinitarianism in the New Testament without serious qualification. There is also the closely parallel recognition on the part of the historians of dogma and systematic theologians that when one does speak of an unqualified Trinity, one has moved from the period of Christian origins to the last quadrant of the 4th century. It was only then that what might be called as definite Trinity dogma, one God in three people, became thoroughly assimilated into Christian life and thought. Unquote. Tracing the origins of pagan customs, rites, festivals and religious services of the pagans in Christianity, another historian of the Christian Church gives a graphic account of the persistent endeavors of early Christians to ape the idolatrous nations. Reverend James Houston Baxter the professor of history in the University of St. Andrews, writes in the History of Christianity in the Light of Modern Knowledge, quote, "If paganism had been destroyed, it was less through annihilation than through absorption into Christianity. Almost all that was pagan was carried over to survive under the Christian name. Deprived of demigods and heroes, men easily and half-consciously invested a local martyr with their attributes and labeled the local statue with his name, transferring to him the mythology associated with the pagan gods. Before the century was over, the martyr cult was universal, and a beginning had been made of that imposition of a deified human being between God and man, which on one hand had the consequence of Arianism and was on the other the origins of so much that is typical of the medieval deity and practice. Pagan festivals were adopted and renamed. By 400 AD, the Christmas day, the ancient festival of the sun, was transferred and transformed into the birthday of Jesus Christ." Unquote. By the 6th century, the antagonism between Christians of Syria, Iraq and Egypt on the question of human and divine natures of Jesus Christ had set them as one another's throat and waging war against each other. The conflict had virtually turned every Christian seminary, church and home into a hostile camp, each one of them at the throat of another and thirsting for its adversary's blood. Men debated with fury upon shadows or shades of belief and staked their lives on the most immaterial issues, as if these differences meant a confrontation between two different religions or nations. The Christians were thus neither inclined nor had the time to set their own house in order and smoothen the ever-increasing viciousness in the world for the salvation of humanity. In Iran, from the earliest times, the Magians worshipped four elements, of which fire was the chief object of devotion, in the oratories or the fire temples, for which they had evolved a whole mass of intricate rituals and commandments. In actual practice, the popular religion included nothing except the worship of fire and adoration of the shining sun. Certain rituals performed in the place of worship were all that their religion demanded of them. After performing these rites, they were free to live as they desired. There was nothing to distinguish a Magian from an unconscious, crazy person. Arthur Christensen writes in his famous book, quote, "It was incumbent on the civil servants to offer prayers 4 times a day to the sun, besides fire and water. Separate rhymes were prescribed for the rising and going to sleep, taking bath, putting on the sacred cord, eating and drinking, sniffing, hairdressing, cutting of the nails, excrements, and lighting the candle, which were to be rectified on each occasion with the greatest care. It was the duty of the priests to compound, purify, and tend the sacred fire, which was never to be extinguished, nor was water ever allowed to touch the fire, no metal was allowed to rust, for metals too were hallowed in their own religion." Unquote. All the prayers were performed facing the sacred fire. The last Iranian emperor, Yazgrid III, once took an oath saying, "I swear by the sun, which is the greatest of all gods." Unquote. He had ordered that those who had abjured Christianity to re-enter their original faith should publicly worship the sun in order to prove their sincerity. The principle of dualism, the two ritual rival spirits of God and evil, had been upheld by the Iranians for such a long time that it became a mark and a symbol of their national identity. They believed that Ormuzd creates everything good and Ahriman creates all that is bad. These two are perpetually at war, and the one and the other gains the upper hand alternatively. The Zoroastrian legends described by the historians of religion bear remarkable resemblance to the hierarchy of gods and goddesses and the fabulousness of Hindu and Greek mythology. Buddhism, and extending from India to Central Asia, had been converted into an idolatrous faith, that is, having a significant amount of idol worship. Wherever the Buddhists went, they took the idols of Buddha with them and installed them there. Although the entire religion and cultural life of the Buddhists is overshadowed by idolatry, the students of religion had grave doubts whether Buddha was a nihilist or believed in the existence of God. They were surprised how this religion could at all sustain itself in the absence of any faith or conviction in God. In the 6th century AD, Hinduism had shot ahead of every other religion in the number of gods and goddesses. During this period, 33 million gods were worshipped by the Hindus. The tendency to regard everything which could do harm or good as an object of personal devotion was at its height, and this had given a great encouragement to stone sculptures with novel motifs to decorative ornamentation. Describing the religious condition of India during the reign of Harsha, which is 606 to 648 AD, a little before the time when Islam made its debut in Arabia, a Hindu historian, C.V. Vaidya writes in the history of medieval Hindu India. Both Hinduism and Buddhism were equally idolatrous at this time, he says, quote, "If anything, Buddhism perhaps beat the former in its intense idolatry. That religion started indeed with the denial of God, but then ended up making Buddha himself the supreme God. Later developments of Buddhism added other gods like Bodhisattva, and the idolatry of Buddhism, especially in the Mahayana school, was firmly established. It flourished in and out of India, so much so that the word for the idol in Arabic had become Buddha itself." He further says, quote, "No doubt idolatry was at this time rampant all over the world. From the Atlantic to the Pacific, the world was immersed in idolatry, Christianity, Semitism, Hinduism and Buddhism vying, so as to speak, one with another in their adoration of idols." Another historian of Hinduism expresses the same opinion about the sixth passion for multiplicity of deities among the Hindus in the 6th century. He writes, quote, "The process of deification did not stop here. Lesser gods and goddesses were added in their ever-growing numbers till there was a crowd of gods, many of them adopted from the primitive people who were admitted to Hinduism with the gods whom they already worshipped. The total number of gods is said to have become 330 million, which, like the phrase, 'your name is legion,' merely implies an innumerable number of hosts. In many parts of the country, the minor gods receive as much or even more reverence than the major gods." Unquote. The Arabs had been followers of Abrahamic religions in the olden times and had the honor of having the first house of God in their own lands. But the distance of time from the greatest patriarchs and the prophets of past and their isolation in the arid deserts of the peninsula had given rise to an abominable idolatry closely approximating the Hindu zeal for idol worship in the 6th century AD. In associating partners to God, they were not behind any other people. Having faith in the companionship of lesser gods with the Supreme Being in the direction and governance of the entire universe, they held the belief that their deities possessed the power to do good or harm or to give life or death. Idolatry in Arabia had reached its lowest ebb. Every region and every clan, or rather every house, had a separate god of its own. 360 idols had been installed within the Kaaba and its courtyard, the house which was built by Prophet Ibrahim, for the worship of one and only God. The Arabs actually paid divine honors not merely to sculpted idols, but venerated all sorts of stones and fetishes. Angels, jinns and stars were also their gods. They believed that the angels were daughters of God and the jinn were his partners in divinity, and thus they both enjoyed supernatural powers whose nullification was essential for their well-being. Social and moral conditions during that time. This was the plight of the greatest religion sent by God from the time to time for the guidance of humanity. In the civilized countries, there were powerful governments and great centers of arts and culture and learning, but their religions had been garbled so completely that nothing of their original spirit and content was left in them, nor were there any reformers or heavenly guided humans to be found anywhere. The Byzantine Empire. Crushed under the burdensome taxes levied by the Byzantine Empire, the allegiance to any alien ruler was considered by the population as less oppressive than the rule of the Byzantine Empire. Insurrections and revolts had become such a common feature that in 532 AD, the public discontent voiced most dramatically in Constantinople by Nika, win or conquer, revolt took 30,000 lives. The only pastime of the chiefs and the nobles was to squeeze wealth on different pretexts from the harassed farmers and squander it on their pleasure and amusement. Their craze for the merriment and revelry very often reached the depths of hideous savagery. The authors of civilization past and present have painted a lurid picture of the contradictory passions of the Byzantine society for religious experience as well as its love for sports and recreation marked by moral corruption. Quote, Byzantine social life was marked by tremendous contrast. The religious attitudes were deeply ingrained in the popular mind. Asceticism, monasticism were widespread throughout the empire, and to an extraordinary degree, even the most commonplace individuals seemed to take a vital interest in the deepest theological discussions, while all the people were much affected by religious mysticism in their daily life. But in contrast, the same people were exceptionally fond of all types of amusements. The great hippodrome, seating 80,000 wide-eyed spectators, was the scene for hotly disputed chariot races, which split the entire populace into rival factions of blue and green. The Byzantines possessed both a love for beauty and a streak of cruelty and viciousness. Their sports were often bloody and sadistic. Their torture was horrible, and the lives of their aristocracy were a mixture of luxury, intrigue, and studied vice. Unquote. Egypt had vast resources of corn and siblings, on which Constantinople largely depended for its prosperity, but the whole machinery of the imperial government in that province was directed for the sole purpose of reaping profits out of the ruled people. In religious matters too, the policy of suppressing the Jacobite heresy was pursued relentlessly. In short, Egypt was like a milk cow whose masters were interested only in the milking her without providing any fodder to her. Syria, another far dominion of the Byzantine Empire, was always treated as a hunting ground for the expansionist policy of the imperial government. The Syrians were treated as slaves at the mercy of their masters, for they could never pretend to have any claim to kind and considerate behavior from their rulers. The taxes levied on them were so excessive an amount and so unjust in incidents that the Syrians had very often to sell their children to clear the government dues. Unwarranted persecution, confiscation of property, and enslavement and impressed labor were some of the common features of the Byzantine rule. The Persian Empire. The Zoroastrianism was the oldest religion of Iran. Zarathustra, the founder of Zoroastrianism, lived approximately 600 to 650 BC. The Persian Empire had, after it, shaken off the influence which was much larger in size and greater in wealth and splendor than the Eastern Roman or the Byzantine Empire. Ardashir I, the architect of a Sasanian dynasty, laid the foundation of his kingdom by defeating Artabanus V in 224 AD. In its heyday of glory, the Sassanid Empire extended from Syria, Khuzestan, Media, Faris, which is Persia, and Mongolia, and right up to Iraq and Yemen. At that time, and had controlled the areas lying near the delta of the river Sindh, which was in Pakistan and India. Madain, the capital of the Sassanids, combined a number of cities on the banks of the Tigris. During the 5th century and thereafter, the Sassanid Empire was known for its magnificence and splendor, cultural refinement, and the life of ease and rounds of pleasure enjoyed by its nobility. Zoroastrianism was founded from the earliest times on the concept of universal struggle between good and evil. In the 3rd century, money appeared on the scene as a reformer of Zoroastrianism. Sapor I, which is 240 to 271 AD, at first embraced the precepts uttered by the innovators, remained faithful to them for 10 years, and then returned to mysticism. The Manichaeism was based on a most thoroughgoing dualism of two conflicting souls in man, one good, one bad. In order, therefore, to get rid of the bad preached Mani, one should practice strict asceticism and abstain from women. Mani spent a number of years in exile and returned to Iran after the accession of Bahram I to the throne, but was arrested, convicted of heresy, and beheaded. His converts mostly remained faithful to his teachings, for which we know that Manichaeism continued to influence Iranian thought and society for a long time, even after the death of Mani. Mazdak, the son of Baudad, was born at Nishapur in the 5th century. He also believed in twin principles of light and darkness, but in order to put down the veil while emanating from the darkness, he preached community of women and goods, which all men should share equally, as they do water, fire, and wind. The Mazdakites soon gained enough influence, thanks to the support of the emperor, to cause communistic upheaval in the entire country. The rowdy elements got liberty to take forcefully the possession of people's wives and properties from other people. In an ancient manuscript known as Nama Tinsar, the ravages done to the Iranian society by the application of this version of Mazdaism has been graphically depicted as below. Quote, chastity and manners were cast to the dogs. They came to the fore who had neither nobility nor character, nor acted uprightly, nor had any ancestral property. Utterly indifferent to their families and nations, they had no trade or calling, and being completely heartless, they had ever willing to get into mischief, to mince the truth, to vilify and malign others, for this was the only profession they knew for achieving wealth and fame. Arthur Christensen concludes in Iran under the Sassanids, quote, the result of that peasant rose into revolt in many places. The bandits started breaking into houses of nobles to prey upon their properties and to abduct their women. Gangsters took possession of land estates, and gradually the agricultural holdings became depopulated, since the new owners knew nothing about cultivation of land. Unquote. Ancient Iran had always a strange proclivity to subscribe to the extremist calls and radical movements, since it has ever been under the influence of irreconcilable political and religious concepts. It has been swinging as if by action and reaction between strict celibacy and complete behavior, which was allowed, and free liberal behavior, and at others either yielded passively to despotic feudalism and kingship and to preposterous priests, or drifted to the other extreme of unruly communism, but has always missed that moderate, poised, and even temper which was so vital for the healthy and wholesome society. Towards the end of the Sasanian period, during the 6th century, all civil and military power was concentrated in the hands of the emperors, who were alienated from the people by an impassable barrier. They regarded themselves as descendants of gods. Khusrau Parvez, or Khusrau II, had lavished upon himself his grandiose surname, the immortal soul among the gods and peerless God among human beings. Glorious in his name, dawning with the sunrise and light of the dark-eyed night. The entire wealth of the country and its resources belonged to the king. The kings, the grandees, the nobles were obsessed with amassing wealth and treasure, costly gems and gold. They were interested only in raising their standard of living and luxury and merriment to an extent that it was now difficult for us to understand their craze for fun and festivity. They can alone visualize their dizzy rounds of luxurious living. Who has studied the history, literature, and poetry of ancient Iran, and is also well informed about the splendor of Khusrau written in multiple books, the tiara of the emperors, the awe-striking court ceremonials, the number of queens and concubines, the slaves, the cooks and the bearers, the birds, the beasts owned by the emperors and their trainers as well. The life of ease and comfort led to the kings and nobles of Persia can be judged from the way Yazgrid III fled after the capture by the Arabs. He had with him during his flight 1,000 cooks, 1,000 singers and musicians, and 1,000 trainers of leopards and 1,000 attendants of eagles, besides innumerable parasites and hangers-on, but the emperor still felt miserable for not having enough to enliven his drooping spirits. The common people were, on the other hand, extremely poor and in great distress. The uncertainty of the taxes at which each man had to pay various taxes gave a pretext to the collectors for exorbitant collections. Impressed labor, burdensome taxes, and conspirations in the army as footman without the inducement of pay or any other reward had compelled a large number of farmers to give up their farming and take refuge in the service of temples and monasteries. In their bloody wars with the Byzantines, which seemed to be never ending and without any interest or profit to the common people, the Persian kings had been plying their subjects as common fodder. India. The remarkable achievements of ancient India in the field of mathematics, astronomy, medicine and philosophy had earned India a lasting fame, but the historians have agreed that the era of India's social and moral and religious degradation commenced from the opening decade of the 6th century. For shameless and revolting acts of sexual behavior were concerted by the religion. Even the temples had degenerated into a cesspool of corruption. Women had lost her honor and respect in the society and had values attached to her chastity. It was not often that the husband, losing in a game of gambling, dealt out even his woman and wife. The honor of the family, especially in the higher classes claiming a noble descent, demanded that the widow should burn herself alive with the funeral fire of her dead husband. The customs upheld by society as supreme acts of fealty on the part of a widow to her late husband was so deep-rooted that it became completely suppressed only after the establishment of British rule in India. India left behind her neighbors, or rather every other country in the world, in evolving an inflexible, inhuman stratisfaction of its society based on social inequality. This system, which exuded the original inhabitants of the country as exterior or outcasts, was formulated to ensure the superiority of the conquering Aryans and was invested with an aura of divine origin of the Brahmins. It canalized every aspect of the people's daily life according to hereditary and occupation of different classes and was backed by religious and social laws set forth by teachers of the religion and legislators. Its comprehensive code of life was applicable to the entire society, dividing the society into 4 different classes: the Brahmins, which were the priests; the Kshatriyas, which were the nobles; the Vaisyas, which were the merchants; and the Shudras, which were the untouchables, and were supposed to serve the first 3 classes. The Shudras, or the Dasis, meaning slaves, forming a majority of the population, believed to have been born from the feet of Brahma, formed the most degraded class which had sunk socially to the lowest level. Nothing was honorable for a Shudra, according to the Manu Shastra, than to serve a Brahmin or any other higher caste. The social laws, according to the Brahmin class, distinctive privileges and an honored place in society. Quote, a Brahmin who remembers the Rig Veda, says Manu Shastra, is absolutely sinless even if he debases all the other 3 worlds or the castes. Neither any tax could be imposed on a Brahmin nor he could be executed for any crime. The Shudras, on the contrary, could never acquire property or have any assets. It was not allowed to sit near a Brahmin or to touch him. The Shudras were not permitted to read the sacred scriptures. India was drying up and losing her vitality, divided into numerous petty states struggling for supremacy against each other. The whole country had become lawless, and misadministration was rampant with tyranny. The country had further severed itself from the rest of the world and retired into her own shell. Her fixed beliefs and growing rigidity of her social structure, norms, rites, and customs had made her mind rigid and static. Its outlook and prejudice of blood, race, color carried within it the seeds of destruction. Vidyadhar Mahajan, former professor of history in Punjab University College, writes about the state of affairs in India on the eve of Muslim conquest. Quote, "The people of India were living in isolation from the rest of the world. There was much contented with themselves that they did not bother about what was happening outside. Their ignorance of the developments outside their country put them in a very weak position. It also created a sense of stagnation amongst them. There was decay on all sides. There was much life in the literature of the period. Architecture, painting, and fine arts were also affected by this. Indian society had become static and the caste system had become very rigid. There was no remarriage of widows, and restriction with regards to food and drink became very rigid. The untouchables were forced to live outside the towns." Arabian Peninsula. The idea of virtue, of morals, was unknown to the ancient Bedouins. Extremely fond of wine and gambling, he was hard-hearted enough to bury alive his own daughter. The pillage of caravans, the cold-blooded murder of people for paltry gains were typical methods to still the demands of the nomads. The Bedouin maiden enjoyed no social status, could be bartered away like other goods or cattle, or inherited by the deceased heir. There were certain foods reserved for men which could not be eaten by women. A man could have as many wives as he liked and could dispose of his children if he had not enough means to provide for their sustenance. The Bedouin was bound by unbreakable bonds of fidelity to his family, blood relations, and finally to the tribe. Fights and forays were his sport, and murder, which was a very trifling small affair for him. A minor incident sometimes gave rise to wars and long-standing warfare between two powerful tribes. Sometimes these wars prolonged as many as 40 years, in which thousands of people would die. Europe. At the beginning of the Middle Age, the torch of knowledge flickered dimly, and all the literary and artistic achievements of the classical past seemed destined to be lost forever under the young and vigorous Germanic race which had risen to political power in northern and western Europe. The new rulers found neither pleasure nor honor in the philosophy, literature, and arts of the nations outside their frontiers, and appeared to be as filthy as their minds were filled with superstition. Their monks and clergymen, passing their lives in a long routine of useless self-torture and quailing before the ghastly phantoms of their delirious brains, were abhorrent to the company of human beings. They still debated the point whether a woman had a soul of a human being or that of a beast, or that she was blessed with a finite spirit or an infinite spirit. She could neither acquire nor inherit any property, nor had the right to sell or transfer any property. Robert Bruffault writes in Making of Humanity's book, quote, "From the 5th to the 10th century, Europe lay sunk in the night of barbarism, which grew darker and darker. It was barbarianism, far more awful and horrible than that of the primitive savage, for it was the decomposing body of what had been once a great civilization. The features of the impress of that society and civilization were all but completely removed. Where its development had been fullest, example in Italy and Gaul, was its ruin, squander, and dissolution." The era of darkness and depression. The 6th century, in which the Prophet of Islam was born, was, to be brief, the darkest era of history. It was the most depressing period in which the crestfallen humanity had abandoned all hope of its revival and renaissance. This is the conclusion drawn by noted historian G.H. Wells, who talked about the conditions of the world at the time when the Sassanids and the Byzantine empires had worn themselves out to a deathlock weariness. Quote, "Science and political philosophy seem dead now in both these wearing and decaying empires. The last philosophers of Athens, until their suppression, preserved the texts of the great literatures of the past with an infinite reverence and the want of understanding, but there remain no class of men in the world, no free gentlemen with bold and independent habits of thought, to carry on the tradition of frank statement and inquiry embodied in these writings. The social and political chaos accounts largely for the disappearance of this class, but there was also another reason why human intelligence was sterile and feverish during this age. In both Persia and Byzantium, it was an age of intolerance. Both empires were religious empires in a way that greatly hampered the free civilities and activities of the human mind." Unquote. The same writer, after describing the events leading to the onslaught of the Sassanids on the Byzantine Empire and the eventual victory of the Byzantine Empire, throws light on the depth of social and moral degradation to which both the great nations had fallen in the following words. Quote, "The prophetic amateur of history surveying the world in the opening of the 7th century might have concluded very reasonably that it was only a question of a few centuries before the whole of Europe and Asia fell under Mongolian domination. There was no sign of order or union in Western Europe, and the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire were manifestly bent upon mutual destruction. India also was divided and wasted." Unquote. Worldwide chaos. To be brief, the entire human race seemed to have betaken itself to the steep and shortest route to self-destruction. Man had forgotten his master and thus had become oblivious of his own self, his future and his destiny. He had lost the sense to draw a distinction between vice and virtue, good and bad. It seemed as if anything that slipped through his mind and heart, but he did not know what it was. He had neither any interest nor time to apply his mind to the questions like faith or the hereafter. He had his hands too full to spare even a moment for what constituted the nourishment of his inner self and the spirit, ultimate redemption or deliverance from evil or from sin, service to humanity and restoration of his own moral health. This was a time when not even a single man could be found in a whole country who seemed to be anxious about his faith, who worshipped the one and only Lord of the world without associating partners to him, and who appeared to be sincerely worried about the darkening future of humanity. This was a situation when obtaining in the world